So guys, I want to mention that I was going to talk about this a few hours ago, but I just woke up because, I worked the night shift at the hospital, and Hulk Hogan just passed away, and I have mixed feelings about this. That for a lot of people who really don't know that, if you grew up with John Cena and you were like alive during this decade, you were born during the time of John Cena, Hulk Hogan was exactly like he was exactly like John Cena as far as popularity. That's kind of like how I relate to it. But ultimately, if you were in the '80s, he was actually a bigger deal than John Cena. Like he was actually the person that really was that wrestler that started the television era. And what I mean by the television era is that the whole 1980s, people watching, wrestling on television, people going to WrestleManias. Like Hulk Hogan was that wrestler, in my opinion, that really um, did that for WWE. He was really that person that started like this mega trend of famous wrestlers. Like honestly, you do not have Stone Cold Steve Austin and his height of popularity. You don't have The Rock and his height of popularity. You don't have John Cena and his popularity without Hulk Hogan. Um, the other thing about Hulk Hogan, I would say, is that he was also a really brave wrestler in the sense of becoming a heel um, in um, in WCW, really, because that was something where there's a lot of people who talk about wrestlers like Will Ospreay in AEW and how he would never turn heel. Or there's people who talk about like how you had John Cena for the longest time in WWE where he should have turned heel a few years ago. But Hulk Hogan, had the bravery to do that, and ultimately that really benefited the company for a while, really, because that just to change your character up, really. Like, so he was also one of those wrestlers that, was like, despite his popularity, he just did something different. And then also the third thing about Hulk Hogan was that one major thing about him is that he worked for WCW because a lot of times in professional wrestling, there were wrestlers that would stick with their company for the longest time, really. For example, you saw Sting be the anti WWE guy. He worked for He worked for WCW for the longest time. Then he worked for TNA. Then he went to WWE. You see somebody like Adam Copeland for the longest time stick with WWE instead of retiring in the company. He went to AEW. So Hogan was also one of those wrestlers that inspired wrestlers to be like, okay, if you don't like WWE, really, you can just venture elsewhere. It doesn't matter how much success, or even if, Vince is somebody that relies on you, if you want to go elsewhere, you want to go elsewhere. And then he was also a wrestler, and he's really like more despised nowadays. And I also have a lot of despise for Hulk Hogan. That he was a wrestler that did a lot of bad things. He was almost like Vince in a way, where he did a lot of good and he did a lot of bad. He did a lot of very bad things. And when I look at Hulk Hogan, he's kind of an asshole. Like he's not that great of a person. The first thing that I'll mention is he ruined TNA wrestling. Like it was him, Eric Bischoff, and Dixie Carter that ruined TNA wrestling because when he came in, he changed a lot of things. He said things like, what the hell is the X Division? What the hell is the six-sided ring? When he came in, he made the company about himself. It was Eric Bischoff mostly who said things like AJ Styles, and AJ Styles shouldn't have a championship. People need to know who he is, really. So he ruined the classic TNA wrestling, really. One of the reasons why TNA wrestling's been struggling, for over a decade, it was because of Hogan and Bischoff. And there was actually that thing, too, where Miley Cyrus did that Wrecking Ball video, and then the day that Hogan quit TNA wrestling, he did a spoof of that. So it was always like Hogan always looked out for Hogan. That old expression, it doesn't work for me, brother. The other thing about Hulk Hogan is that he sabotaged a lot of people. There are people who talked about how in WCW, Macho Man had a lot of momentum, and when Macho Man won the title, you saw Hogan run around the ring and just pointing his arms at Macho Man to be like, hey, look at me, celebrate Macho Man, and Macho Man said stuff like, you're hot dog like grandstanding, and then that hurt their relationship, and then a lot of people talk about how in WWE, obviously there were some wrestlers that benefited by being friends with Hulk Hogan. I think Brutus the Barber Beefcake was his cousin, if I'm correct, really. But there were a lot of wrestlers who benefited from being friends with Hulk Hogan, and there were a bunch of wrestlers who were sabotaged. Like, there's a story that Jesse the Body Ventura, if I'm correct, wanted a wrestling union. He wanted workers' rights, and then Hogan found out about Jesse Ventura wanting to do a boycott, and then he told Vince. So, one of the reasons why AEW and other companies treat their wrestlers better nowadays is because for the longest time, one of the reasons why they treat them better nowadays is because there's a lot more education on how wrestlers have very demanding lifestyles. Or when Chris Benoit died, when he killed his wife and kids, fuck Chris Benoit. And one of the reasons why, one of the big exposures to the wrestling industry was when Chris Benoit died, because people talked about his busy schedule, or people talked about how when wrestlers had concussions or got hit in the head with chairs, you were taught to just take medication, move on, or you were taught things like, okay, you know what, if you're injured or you're hurt, you have to work injured because you don't want to go down the roster. So if you were working almost every single day but the holidays, or every single day and even the holidays and everything's like that, a lot of that was exposed when Chris Benoit killed himself and his wife and kids, really. But one of the reasons why it was like that for a long time, absolutely Vince McMahon. But the second person is Hulk Hogan for being a snake and actually talking to Vince to about that, to sabotage Jesse Ventura and other people who believe in workers' rights and other things like that. For one of the reasons why in professional wrestling for the longest time there has been a lot of rights for wrestlers. There's been really dangerous workloads and work schedules. They're talking about how Will Ospreay has some vertebrae damage. This was 20 years ago, and he was wrestling in WWE or WCW, and Hogan was there. His ass would be wrestling until, he dies at a young age, really. It wouldn't be like what they're doing in AEW or WWE, where somebody's injured and they'll just and they have to go to doctors and whatever, really. Like the whole entire exploitation of wrestlers, but also working through injury, and wrestlers getting having really no rights really for the longest time was because Hulk Hogan chose to be a bitch, really, and talk to Vince about it. The other thing too is that Hulk Hogan had a history of racism. We all remember when he did that video, Bubba Loadsmith, he said something along the lines is that he's upset that his daughter, and I'll use the word, is dating a 7-foot nigger or something like that. And that was kind of that was kind of almost like the polar shift, in my opinion, from him being highly respected to just losing a lot of respect, really. And I want to mention that there are people that I've known. I heard a story about my biological mother that she's a black woman, but she was sexually assaulted by a black man. So she ultimately went from, being cool with everybody to just hating African Americans because of a bad experience. I remember living in a lot of different neighborhoods, and I used to be bullied by a certain race of people throughout my life. And I know it's like to be mixed raced and grow up in a white family where people consider me black, and people used to think that I was autistic. So I remember I've had professors call me a nigger and treat me poorly. And I remember doing the 48-hour film project where people would be talking about my skin color. I remember the first time I did it for New Haven, people were saying it's great that a black man's doing the competition. Why don't you want to work with us? Is that black people want to work with black people? And other things like that. So obviously, I've dealt with self-hate and other things like that because of racism. And there's been times in my life I've given into prejudiced beliefs. So it's definitely one of those things in life where, experiences can make you prejudiced, but ultimately there's no excuse for this. I've taken a lot of therapy, and I've gotten a lot of help to not be a prejudiced person. I know, like, again, I was working at one of my jobs, and I remember like being cursed out by somebody who was really a racial stereotype, and it took me a couple of days to kind of like use ChatGPT or something else to talk about my feelings, and not like be angry about it. Or I remember like this weekend I was like on the Metro North really, and there was this white woman who was like sleeping on a bench really, and was sleeping on the train really, and she was just like sticking her feet out, so people were bumping into her feet. And then what happened was, while I was sleeping on the train, she actually went over to where I was. She was kicking me with her feet. She was putting her feet on my lap really, and I had some thoughts in my head of, oh well, you know what? Here's this white woman doing what white women do best, which is being entitled, thinking that they can do whatever they want really, and being disrespectful, and then being unapologetic. Sometimes I know what it's like to be disrespected by different groups of people, and then just have some racist thoughts through my head. Like, I thought those thoughts, but I know those thoughts are wrong, really, and I may have that for the rest of my life, really. So I understand why some people can be racist. It could be bad experiences around people over and over. It could be that they've been bullied or abused or sexually abused or other things. But it's never good to act on that. You gotta learn to keep those thoughts to yourself. Sometimes use ChatGPT to talk about an experience and say, "Hey, this is how I feel," but I'm not gonna go out in the world and believe that, because it's wrong. Or I remember this weekend at the hospital, I was going to Dunkin' Donuts a couple of times, and there was this homeless black guy that was like harassing me, trying to pick a fight with me because he wants me to go into the Dunkin' Donuts and buy him breakfast. So I've had some angry thoughts about that guy in my head, really, and I stood up for myself. I didn't use any racial slurs, but I remember having a lot of angry thoughts in my head about that person, because I've been bullied and taken advantage of. I remember one time I went to Philadelphia. There was this black homeless woman, and she was calling me a retard and threatening me a bunch of times, really. And I had a bunch of angry thoughts when I walked out of Philadelphia, but I never said anything inappropriate. I actually got revenge, and I called headquarters of 7-Eleven, and I reported that store and saying, hey, here's this woman, and it was true. She was panhandling people, she was fighting people, and she was doing all that stuff, and she was standing up at the register. So it's almost like she was telling people, if you don't give people a cut of your change, she's going to be arguing and acting kind of mean and ghetto, really. And for people running a 7-Eleven, you can't be standing there in the back and smiling and being like, oh well, we don't know how to handle this. You got to throw that person out, because people are not going to come back when that's happening, really. So I think what I'm trying to say with Hulk Hogan is that, unfortunately, he was just like me. He had a lot of impulse issues. Unfortunately, with me, he's had difficulties in his life. I think that, if I remember correctly, one of his sons died, or one of his sons was involved in a vehicle accident, and I believe either severely injured somebody else, and his son had to go to jail for a couple of years. The family had to pay a lot of money. He dealt with divorces. Obviously, when that incident happened with Bubba Love Sponge, there was a private video of him put online for money, really. So he was also somebody in a lot of ways who did not respond to the challenges of life appropriately. He was a compulsive liar. He was also somebody who sabotaged a lot of people. He had some prejudice. And I also felt like, again, he felt that he was bulletproof. He felt like he could do whatever he wanted, really. So, again, Hulk Hogan is a controversial figure. He is an example of somebody who did a lot for the industry, but ultimately got fired by throwing people under the bus, and that's part of the history. But also, he was somebody who had a lot of demons, and he was not somebody who did a good job at fighting his demons. Almost like how it took such a long time for Jeff Hardy to not have consistent issues with, drugs and alcohol and coming into work in bad conditions, really. It's hard, but we got to fight our demons. We got to fight our demons. We got to just be better people and all that. So he is a reminder that we got one life to live, and sometimes we go further than we can ever dream upon. But when you are that really that top person, you go farther. The company relies on you. You really have to think about your legacy, because ultimately his legacy is riddled with controversies. He's also a wrestler that screwed over a lot of people and destroyed a lot of people to get ahead, really. And it's good when there are people like me who say that's the whole picture. So I mean, rest in peace, Hulk Hogan, but to hell with you for the type of person, the backstabby person that he was. So it's important to recognize both sides of his legacy. And sometimes I even say to myself, it's good riddance that he's not alive anymore, because of, really, not just really the detriments he's caused people. He's hurt a lot of people in his career, and he didn't really think about it. And sometimes when you're successful, you develop that mindset, and it's unfortunate that he did, really. He's a controversial people. He did start the wrestling boom. He really started this trend of the megastar wrestler, and that's done so much for the wrestling industry, more good than harm. But he's also an example of somebody who just ruined a lot of lives to get his ass ahead. So, rest in peace, but also to hell with you, Hulk Hogan.